virtual national security briefing. In this time of COVID, we've gone to virtual meetings so that we can keep reaching our stakeholders, our students, our faculty and staff at the university, and bringing interesting panelists to you. I appreciate the support of Leidos for making this series possible. Bill Bender, who's on our board, has been an outstanding sponsor for this and has allowed us to bring in very interesting speakers. We'll be taking questions from the questions submitted before the call in your registration, as well as taking questions that are entered into the chat. I'll read those questions to the panelists when the appropriate time comes, and we'll let them address those questions as they like. We're going to go ahead and get started with some remarks by Vint Cerf and Josh Marcuse. Vint is a chief internet evangelist at Google. And in addition, I think all of you probably know him without any introduction as one of the fathers of the internet. And I've admired his work for a very long time. It's great to hear from him. Also joining him is Josh Marcuse, who's the head of strategy and innovation at the Google Global Public Sector. He's a former executive director of the Defense Innovation Board. And although they're both affiliated with Google, this is not a Google-sponsored event or Google's opinions. They're their own opinions, and they can so state as they like, but we're getting to hear from them and their perspective over their career on topics of national security and bridging the divide between the technology sector and national security, and very broad views from Vint. So I'm going to turn it over to Vint now and let him start off the remarks, and then he and Josh will make some introductory remarks, and we'll then go into other question and answer throughout the session. We look forward to the conversation. Vint, over to you.
Thanks so much, James, and I really appreciate the opportunity for Josh and for me to speak to all of you this morning. I'd like to start out by observing that these are perilous times, and it's not just because of the pandemic that has the world in its grip. There are other very key, I would say, challenges before us as a country and as a planet. So in this conversation, I'd like to use the term national security in a very broad sense. And I think I'd like to draw upon all of your intuitions about what infrastructure means, what our social and economic system means. National security is about protecting that socio-economic system. But that means the healthcare system, it means the finance system, it means transportation, it means communications. Internet is turned out to be a pretty important part of our response to the pandemic, for example. It means—
I'm going to interrupt you for just 1 second and ask you to turn on your camera.
Well, my camera appears to be on, so I don't understand what has happened. Let's see what— oh, I see what's happened. I had covered up a display with some notes. And the display said, "Do you want to turn your camera on?" And the little light is on, and I assumed that meant the camera was on, and it's okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so but everybody heard that part at the beginning, so we can keep going. Yes. Anyway, there's a long list of things that make up infrastructure, and in my view, we should be considering all of those things in the context of the discussion that we're going to have today. Think about supply chain resilience. We discovered our supply chains are not working as well as we would like, especially in the context of the pandemic, where we're not able to allow people to co-locate as we would normally do, and so that interferes with the supply chain and many other things as well. Think about advanced manufacturing. Think about 3D printing. Think about all the various new technologies that are coming along that should allow us to rethink some of the way in which our social and economic infrastructure actually works. The second thing, which I believe is a serious consideration, is whether our existing institutions are still fit for purpose. And I think as we look at dysfunctional portions of the way our government works right now, and the way our industry works, and the way in which our system of operation works, we should be asking ourselves whether our institutions need to be rethought and reincarnated. I think everyone on this call would agree that trust has diminished in every dimension you can think of. Trust in institutions, trust in social trust, political trust, economic trust has diminished dramatically, and it's very hard to rebuild trust And that is going to be one of our most important objectives, I think, as we rethink how to respond to crises like these. Josh is no stranger to innovation. And the thing that I would impress upon you is that innovation is stillborn if you don't actually implement it. And so how many times have I heard someone say, well, I thought of that 20 years ago. And my reaction is, yes, but did you do anything about it? They've had a few people say, well, I figured out the internet before you did. And I said, well, that's wonderful, but did you do anything? And the answer was no. And I said, well, there you go. Finally, planning. Planning is vital. And the reason it's so important is that you want to plan for crises in particular before they happen. This is not too different than the awkward sort of period when you're trying to do a contract with someone. You're going to work with them. You're all excited about this joint thing. And your lawyer comes and says, okay, now we have to talk about what happens when you don't agree with each other anymore, or somebody has breached the contract. And you're sort of saying, well, that sort of spoils the whole, feeling here. We're all, in this together. What's the problem? And the lawyer will say, yeah, but if it doesn't happen that way, and if you come to a point where you really are in disagreement, why don't you agree now while you're friends about how you're going to deal with that, as opposed to trying to deal with it while you're in the middle of a battle? The same thing is generally true for other kinds of planning, not least of which is planning for national security and response to various and sundry threats. We should plan on those now. Everyone understands that plans are never exactly what you actually execute, but they allow you to explore the territory of possibilities and try to be prepared for what those possibilities are. I've never had to fight in a war, but everybody tells me that after the war starts, throw out all the plans because they don't reflect the real battlefield. But what they did do is help you think your way through contingencies, and that's important. So here we are, having done a very poor job of preparing and planning for this particular pandemic. We should be thinking in very broad terms about planning for all the various threats that lie ahead of us. So that's my kind of broad brush framing of the discussion that I hope that Josh and I can have, and that you will contribute to in the course of our Q&A. I know Josh has given a lot of thought to this and actually can dive into a bit more concreteness with regard to some of these broad concepts. So Josh, let me ask if you would introduce us to some of the ideas that you wanted to put on the table.
That's fantastic, Vint, and thank you for framing this as broadly as it needs to be, which I think is much beyond the defense questions or the national security questions, but appreciating all the ways in which it is interwoven into the rest of our society. But for the students at the National Defense University institution, with which I'm proud and pleased to be very familiar, I know they're deeply concerned with this question of our industrial strength, our relationship with business and industry, and how it is integrated, or how it can be better integrated with the way in which we prepare for war, and ultimately, if we do in fact have to, break the social contract and exercise those clauses and find ourselves in a kind of contingency or emergency, they're the ones called upon to take on that responsibility. And I think that we all are having this conversation today because there is a growing recognition over the last decade, which in the last 3 or 4 years, I would say, has reached a crescendo, that things are not everything they need to be or that we want them to be in the relationship between the technology sector and the Department of Defense. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. I would go a step further just to make sure that we strike the right tone today, which is to say it is actually a crisis. I would refer to it as a digital readiness crisis. The department has for 25 years gotten very good at measuring readiness for our industrial systems, our material, our hardware, our personnel. But I think there's a new dimension of warfare, which we'll talk about today, which is purely digital. And if we were to try to come up with metrics to understand our readiness for those dimensions of both our business operations and our competition with adversaries, I would argue that those readiness statistics would show our leaders that our current department is in a state of crisis. And let me try to unpack why that is and why the relationship with the technology sector, as James defined it, is so crucial. So the fundamental shift is that we have the finest military in the world, in the history of the world, and it reached that state born in the industrial era. The systems that have given us our edge were really rooted in the marriage of US industry and the US military in the Second World War. And we have done a number of things to improve upon that in the decades that followed. But every conversation I've had at the Eisenhower School about mobilization and the defense industrial base always harken back to a period where we are lionizing the relationship between the car manufacturers that pivoted to tanks and planes. And so we think about how we manage our people and our talent in the military. We think about how we think about our relationship to the venerable companies that build the material that we go to war with. It is very much influenced by the thinking of the industrial era. In a company like where Vint and I work at Google and all the other companies that have come out of Silicon Valley in the last 20 years, all of those that were built on the backs of the internet or the cloud native companies have been completely unlocked or unshackled from this industrial thinking, because they're generally software driven companies. And so they are operating on a different set of assumptions about what is hard and what is easy, what is expensive and what is cheap, what is valuable and what is not, and that is because they are operating in a digital world. The fundamental challenge of the department is that it is trying to move from industrial thinking to digital thinking, and that is an incredibly difficult transition to make. Ashley, if you would throw up the first slide. So in the last few years, with the arrival of a new national security strategy from the White House, a new term was coined, which is National Security Innovation Base. For decades, we talked about the defense industrial base, but the White House, in setting its strategy for the government, realized that there was a need to talk about a different, broader set of organizations and institutions. And it's hard to define. It's actually not well defined in the strategy. And so I think for several years now, we've been trying to figure out how to define it. So what I would recommend for that definition is to define as the defense industrial base those companies whose primary purpose is to support defense institutions. For them, they generally speaking have, usually one customer. And if it's not our military, it's allied militaries. They are in a highly, highly regulated environment. I would say they are the most regulated companies in the world, with the exception perhaps of public utilities. It's almost more helpful to think about them as a public utility, because the government tells them what they can build, it tells them who they can sell it to, it tells them how much they can charge, it tells them how much they can, in some cases, pay their own staff on those contracts. It defines in law what margins they can charge on their business. So it is a business model that is largely defined by the customer as well as by the firm. And that's important because we don't want to have an unfettered market for weapons that can kill thousands, in some cases millions of people, but we have to appreciate the economic externalities of making those choices. The National Security Innovation Base recognizes that those companies are supported and supplied by a set of entirely commercially driven firms that produce the microelectronics, the circuitry, the computers, the hardware, and all the things that are creating the competitive advantage of the defense industrial base. But those companies don't see themselves as being part of the defense establishment. They don't identify themselves proudly as the defense industrial base does. They have a much more complicated set of relationships with a wider variety of customers. They're global companies. They are consumer-facing customers, and they are successful when they are commercially viable. And so they are not optimized, organized, or regulated to meet the needs of the defense customer. And yet, we are increasingly appreciating how our competitive military advantage is dependent on these companies. And whereas if I ask someone at Lockheed Martin or Boeing or Raytheon if they're part of the defense industrial base, those employees are proud to say that they are. But if I were to ask someone at, these, call them digital first companies or Silicon Valley born companies or AI companies or cloud first companies, they don't see themselves that way. And I think that in the last few years, there is an emergent middle category of companies that are now so habituated to working on national security issues that they have organized divisions of their companies for that purpose, and they have made it a priority. And I put in the middle of this Venn diagram companies that really are living in both worlds. And I also threw in there the appreciation that universities are part of the national security innovation base as well today, because so much of their basic research and original research ends up commercialized as part of our competitive advantage or edges as in the West. So let's go to the next slide. So what we're navigating here is the sense that we have this incredibly mature set of relationships with the defense industrial base. We have the Office of Industrial Policy. We have a very dense set of linkages with the congressional oversight committees that are spending a lot of time with both the companies and also the executive branch agencies. There's decades of history here. There's a strong cultural affinity. There are people that go back and forth between the government and these companies all the time, so they really understand each other and how they work. And there's such a shared destiny economically that it's a very tight coupling relationship. It's not to say that there aren't challenges and debates and disputes and contention, but they're a really closely coupled ecosystem. The National Security Innovation Base, however, is actually a very new set of frontiers for DoD at the subject of this conversation. We set up 4 years ago the Defense Innovation Unit, and I would say every year that passes, each of the services and other field agencies are now starting to focus more and more on the companies that are part of the National Security Innovation Base, but not part of the Defense Industrial Base. But these are new relationships, and they're troubled. There are moments of collaboration, but there are moments of conflict. There are real differences to be worked out. This is the subject of our talk today. But one of the things I think is not as well appreciated as it needs to be is the relationship between these defense-focused companies and these dual-use companies and these commercial-facing companies, because our ability to at speed and at scale drive forward new competitive advantages in military technology is at the intersection or the nexus of our ability to do hardware and software well. And the comparative advantages that have made defense industrial based companies the best in the world at producing military hardware makes it extremely difficult for them to also have a comparative advantage and specialization in the things that have made these internet first companies, these software companies, equally good at that. And there are maybe no examples of companies that are equally good at both. So the question for us as we plan our future in defense industrial base is, how do we navigate those teaming and partnering relationships and economic incentives and cultural differences? This is very important, but it's also not just important, it's really urgent. So Ashley, if you go to the next slide, please. The urgency is driven by the fact that our competitors have a completely different set of relationships. If the triangle that I described on the left is complex, civil military fusion and the ability to align those boundaries and to command cooperation and to enforce and influence it is a much more efficient system. And in this sense, the structural advantages that we had in innovation for half a century of our civil liberties, property rights, free markets, capitalism, those things that were in fact the drivers of our success in the past now appear to be threatening us because our competitor, countries like the People's Republic of China, has figured out how to make a Chinese communist system with characteristics that very much resemble our companies, and with less respect for intellectual property, they've been able to create their own versions of our innovative companies, and those companies work seamlessly with the defense and intelligence establishment in their country. And as they begin to be more ambitious geopolitically, it poses some very difficult questions for us about how will we get our democracy and rights-based system that cherishes liberty and free markets to cooperate with our government as efficiently and seamlessly as their system. Because this race to go from the industrial advantage to the digital advantage is going to be a race which determines the winners and losers in future geopolitical competitions. And we find ourselves very much in the middle of that contest. You please to the last slide. So I would leave it to you for our conversation, basically 3 things. First, what is the future of the defense industrial base, and how can we help propel them forward to gaining continual advantage and modernize the defense industrial base and help support that? That's an important question. Second, how do we improve the relationship with the national security innovation base, venture-backed companies, new entrants, tech companies, those unfamiliar with DoD, with its problems, its challenges, its people, its rules, its regulations? How do we improve that relationship? But I would offer you there's a third question, which we can discuss today, which is, what does it look like at the base of the pyramid to have this holistic approach that really draws on all of the different strengths that we have as our society, and recognize that it requires not only heightened trust, but also aligning the economics? And with that, I'll throw it back to you, Vint, and to James.
So thank you. This is very helpful framing. And now I'm going to dispute what you've just said and say that you didn't go far enough. The focus of attention cannot solely be on war fighting. And in particular, I want to draw attention to the fact that our infrastructure writ large, as I was describing it before, is under threat. When it doesn't work properly, and if it can be undermined, particularly to the extent that that infrastructure is increasingly dependent on things like software and cloud-based computing, and all the things that have made many of the companies, including Google, very successful. That collection of infrastructure is now depending on a fragile base, and the fragile base is essentially made more fragile by the fact that software is vulnerable and it's being exploited. What that means is that the attacks that we might encounter are perhaps less physical than they will be cyber attacks, than they will be, digital attacks. And we have not done a very good job of evaluating, analyzing, and preparing our infrastructure, which is increasingly dependent on digital technology, to essentially defend ourselves from that kind of an attack. So you can easily imagine overspending on military equipment and underspending on all of the things that our infrastructure writ large is increasingly dependent upon. I don't think that it's the Defense Department's job alone to cope with that. And the reason for that is that the bulk of that infrastructure that I am so concerned about is actually in the hands of the private sector, or maybe the public sector if you think about public utilities and things like that. But for the most part, all of that technical digital infrastructure is private sector property, so to speak, and it is under threat. And the people who operate it don't necessarily recognize the extent to which it's under threat, nor do they invest in order to defend against that threat, because it hasn't necessarily, I guess, dawned on them, in spite of the headlines that we see constantly about various and sundry exposures of personal information and so on. So in some sense, I think I am arguing that your characterization of the national security innovation base is too narrowly focused on defense, hardware and weapon systems, and we need to back away from that and look much more broadly at how we invest in the defense of the country across its entire infrastructure. So that would be my first reaction to what you said. So it doesn't diminish what you're saying, but it broadens the area of attention. Second, I would argue that procurement is not our friend here. When you're dealing with software, you never get it right the first time. In fact, a friend of mine used to have a little sign above his desk that said, "Software is like pancakes, throw away the first one." And the thing I've learned repeatedly is that you iterate your way into successful software, and that's certainly true for the internet. We went through 4 different iterations of the protocol designs over a period of 5 or 6 years before we got to something that we thought was reasonably reliable. So procurement should not be write a big giant spec, hand it to somebody and say bid on this and then build it. It needs to be a collaborative, cooperative, and iterative thing. And we need to build that into our procurement thinking for everything, not just for military systems. I will point out that the Defense Department, and particularly the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, ONR, AFOSR, and so on, have been core investors in innovation, and I know you know that. And we wouldn't have the internet if it hadn't been for DARPA way back in the 70s. So a lot of innovation, which eventually finds its way into commercial use, originated because of innovative investments by our Defense Department. There's lots more, but I realize we need to get to questions, and you may want to react to my attack against your narrow-minded position. I will also say that we need to have better measures of readiness with regard to the infrastructure that we're relying upon, and we don't. It's almost like not having adequate testing for the pandemic. We don't have adequate testing that tells us how well can we react to cyber attacks? Can we detect them? Can we defeat them? Can we respond? And I think if you look broadly at the private sector, you find, and frankly, the defense sector as well, you find that we are not adequately able to do that, sufficient to make sure that our infrastructure is in fact secure against an attack which doesn't blow up anything. We don't, you don't see any smoke or fire or anything else, but it undermines the system, and it could do so in a very surreptitious way, and then one day, bang, nothing works. Okay, James, you must, well, first of all, Josh, you might want to react, and then James, I know you have questions.
Yeah, I think that as you said yourself, the argument you're making is consonant with the one I did, although somewhat more expansive. I think that the only effort I would make to reconstruct it is to say that the military is called upon to defend the critical infrastructure of the country, but it has to be somewhat focused and narrow in terms of how it generates that capability. So I think that we're both saying the same thing, but from the perspective of my saying how the organization of the Department of Defense needs to evolve in order to protect all the different new dimensions of our society that are vulnerable to attack. But that actually, we have to be a bit narrow and focused in terms of how we can try to steer the ship, because the acquisition and procurement challenges that you described around software are the central thrust of the problem, and it is the natural implication of the inability to pivot from the industrial to the digital. And so there's no greater epitome of our obsolete, outdated system than our requirements process that generally takes 7 years to write a requirement, 7 years to let a contract, 15 years to deliver a capability, which, even though you could argue Moore's law is slowing down, let's just say it takes 1 or 2 Moore's law cycles to write a requirement. So how could the requirement ever be right? And it's the Defense Acquisition University, not the National Defense University, that's primarily responsible for exploring future change. But if you accept, as I do, and I think you do, that our future military advantages are software defined, then you need to design an acquisition system built for acquiring software. And we have an acquisition system that is built for acquiring large, heavy metal objects. Right? The software is relegated to an opaque box, and I'm not talking about the AI black boxes. I'm saying if you want to add software capability to a system, it is usually purchased by buying a metal box and bolting it to your ship or tank. And that mentality, which is an accommodation to our inability to accelerate how we choose what we buy, is going to be the sea anchor that drags us to the bottom of the ocean.
So I know, James, you want to get to questions, but you know what? This really this is going to be a battle of discussion, I should say, even after we get off this program, because Josh and I really have to sort this out. I just want to emphasize the fact that there is more than the Defense Department that needs to be engaged in order to maintain the safety and security of the infrastructure that our society depends on. And we have to empower somehow the people who hold that infrastructure and manage and operate it to help them be able to defend it, because we can't use the Defense Department solely in order to do that.
That's true.
We do call upon it to do all kinds of things, including reconstructing things that, in crises and the like. But we have this gigantic private sector infrastructure that needs to be protected, and it is inadequately protected right now. I remember working with NSA on the Enduring Security Framework effort that tried to bring industry together with the Defense Department's capacity to understand what the problems were and what the threats were. And we still don't have a linkage there that is adequately effective. to allow the private sector to respond. Okay, enough. You and I will continue this conversation, guaranteed, after this exciting exchange. James, you have questions that you'd like to pose, so we're waiting for them.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is a very interesting discussion because it goes to the broader picture. What do we need to do as a nation in order to be well prepared in our infrastructure, in our military, and in the bridges between them? And that was part of the original framing for the discussion. What is the bridge between the technology industry and defense? But it's got to go much broader than that. I think I've seen some interesting examples. General Shanahan at the JAIC just said, I think yesterday, that they need to have their own procurement authority in order to do well. But in the interim, what they did was issued an $800 million contract to Booz Allen Hamilton to be the intermediary with these smaller, more agile firms, because they thought that would be the key to that. I also think this is an interesting time for our country in the sense of COVID. The pandemic has done a lot of damage to our economy. We've talked a lot about how do we get people back to work. We've talked a lot about the need to do infrastructure. And maybe this is the opportunity to do that infrastructure work in a way that meets our national security needs and protects the infrastructure on the civilian side, all of the power plants and the dams and all of the other things that we don't think about in that same sense, but that we know that are at risk. And I haven't heard any discussion about the financial sector, but that's obviously a component as well.
I did bring that up in my list anyway, and that's a very vital part, of course, of the way our society, our social and economic system works. And online transactions are increasingly popular because of their convenience, but they're also increasingly risky.
And right now, it looks like we're deferring most of the security infrastructure to contractors and through their contracts to their subcontractors rather than having our own ability to engage and work on that security at that level of each individual firm. And so that begins to be really important as well. I have a couple of questions. Go ahead.
I want to ask Josh a question because of what you just mentioned. I had been wondering in my years working with DoD whether we had become remarkably and strikingly dependent on the private sector for warfighting capability and in wartime and not just peacetime. And that we ended up actually dragging civilians into wartime situations because of the complexity of the systems that we were relying upon. And it felt like that didn't sound right to me somehow, that we had created and built, caused to be built, such complex systems that we could not run them ourselves in the Defense Department, that we had to draw the civilian sector in. So suddenly we're no longer drawing the boundaries that we used to draw around military operations. And in some way, I'm also suggesting that the boundaries are evaporating between what we normally think of as national security and what we normally think of as homeland security. I think those are blurring partly because of the digital infrastructure which we are increasingly relying on. Sorry, just had to jump in. James, you had first question.
Well, the question I think I'm going to go to now is based on the discussion that we're just having. The question comes from Robert Elder. It's, competition is a driving factor in DoD acquisition. Can you discuss competition in private sector versus competition from a DoD acquisition perspective and the opportunity to improve DoD acquisition by leveraging private sector approaches? And I think that goes to the discussion you were having earlier on the divide between the defense industrial base and the national security innovation base, as well as what China has done. And I'll throw in another comment from a questioner, which is how do we learn from organizations like the unit in Israel that bridges their innovation, Unit 8200, between industry and the military?
I'm sure Josh has a better answer than I do. My first reaction to this question is, hang on just a second. You're not likely to find random companies saying, okay, I'm going to go design an F-57 fighter airplane and see if I can get somebody to buy it from me. So there's a range of stuff that you just would not go and build on spec. Whereas in the private sector, we do it all the time. The venture capital people spend money, place bets. At Google, we do all kinds of things, try them out. Some of them don't work. But I think that the product space is very different. So Josh, how would you arm wrestle with the distinctions, and are there any possibilities of doing innovative things on the digital side that for the Defense Department that would be kind of like what happens in the private sector? I mean, we offer web-based services to lots and lots of entities, including the Defense Department. So, you know, how would you draw that line?
So Josh, I'm going to ask you to incorporate into your answer a little bit of discussion on where we do build those things on spec, and talk perhaps about 5G and the fact that 5G is going to be increasingly adopted in the defense sector and national security sector, but it was developed more on the private sector side.
Thanks, James. There's a lot of different places we could take these response, because there's so many good questions that have been surfaced just in the last few minutes. But I would say that what we're really talking about is trying to figure out how to optimize the ecosystem of when we see these, you know, whether it's built on spec or not, where we see these different applications of software or digital capabilities being married up with the hardware capabilities that we need in order to achieve an effect in the real world. What that means is that when we're trying to figure out what our industrial policy is, we're trying to optimize for an industrial base that is stable and predictable and resilient. We want there to be competition, but to be honest, there are a lot of things that are more important to us than competition. If you look at the behavior of the department over time, there are many variables that it's optimizing for as it works with Congress to figure out how we're going to build our budget of what we're going to buy. So it's really not about competition alone. Whereas in the national security innovation base, where a lot of the drivers of decisions are not being made by the US government, the competition in that market is defined by global forces and economic forces that are often outside of the control, or at least only partially under control of the government. So there's much, much more competition there. And generally, I think that's a good thing, because we appreciate that competition drives progress and often helps bring price down. And so one of the things that you're observing is the differences, the differential pressures, if you will, between where we think competition is really good and where we think competition is a bit mixed. Where we are at our best, to your question about sort of where is the example or the sweet spot, we're at our best when we work with companies to build hardware platforms that support rapid and competitive digital innovation on top of them. So to be more specific, we know that we're going to build platforms that will have to last for decades. You know, bombers that will be in the air for decades, ships that will be at sea for decades. We know that we're going to have platforms for a long time. So we have to ask ourselves, how do I design those platforms so they can be very rapidly upgraded by software? And ideally, rapidly upgraded by software by a company different than the company that built the hardware, because that is how you get competition. So my ideal, let's say, you know, fighter plane of the future, or my ideal, space-based surveillance system of the future will be one where we can uncouple the hardware requirement from the software requirement. We can have a regular refresh and upgrade cycle for the hardware, but a much more rapid cycle for upgrading the software, and a much more competitive process for doing that. And one of the ways in which we take a lot of that competition out is that we allow a lot of proprietary interfaces and code that the government doesn't have access to understand, which introduces a lot of the cyber risks that have been described at the beginning. So my ideal system would be one where the government has the STEM talent, the technical talent, to have a far greater degree of ownership over the operation of that system overall, to Vint's earlier point, and where there is a great opportunity and a role to play for the industrial giants that bend metal and do it better than anyone else. But we should open up competition over the software-defined advantages of that so that that can rapidly iterate over time. And that allows us to have the stability that we need in the industrial base, but the constantly advancing competitive edge in the software, so we can bring in new algorithms, new data, new linkages to new systems, bring in data from allies and partners, and imagine new ways of fighting and new ways of defending ourselves. And that isn't possible if everything is defined by one requirement on one contract.
So I would like to respond to the 5G question and also augment Josh's observation by pointing out that we are best at creating enabling technologies. A lot of the people who are in this industrial innovation base are very good at creating enabling technologies which other people can use to build applications. So think about the layering, which is enabled apps on mobile phones, smartphones. Nobody who writes the app has to understand how a smartphone works. All they have to know is what's the interface to the software that's in the smartphone, the operating system that's in the smartphone. Internet was designed to be a layered architecture of protocols, and it's extremely open, so that if you want to add a new protocol in any layer, pretty much you're free to do that if you create a new functional capability for the system, and that has happened over the last 50 years. So this enabling notion is really powerful, and it's one where companies like Google and others can really excel. I have a couple of Teslas, and you know, you get in and the thing says every once in a while, guess what I can do today what I couldn't do yesterday? And of course, my first reaction is, please tell me you can still do all the other stuff that I was depending on yesterday, as opposed to only the new thing that you just did. On the 5G space, I'm actually extremely worried about this particular technology. I'm worried for several reasons. The first one, of course, is that we see the Huawei arguments and the Chinese interest in 5G, and there's questions about whether that software is, you know, potentially hazardous or not. The second thing is, in which frequency domain are we investing? And for a while, we were investing heavily in the 28 gigahertz space, because you get higher bandwidths that way, because you have, you know, larger chunks of spectrum in order to transmit. But the requirement for the base stations shrinks dramatically when you're up in those higher frequencies, and that means more expense and more optical fiber needs to be pulled, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that's very worrisome for some of us is that the interface to the 5G systems, this is not just about frequency. This is about the actual control of the equipment. And that control is being cast in hardware, so that you have to interface to the 5G systems at their control plane. And that control plane is below the level of the internet. And the consequence is that this system may leach away control of the internet down into the hardware control planes. And that could have a deleterious effect on our ability to manage diverse systems, because internet does not run solely on 5G, it runs on all other transport systems as well, and we're relying on the fact that we can sweep these multiple different transmission technologies into one common infrastructure. So I'm very concerned about the way in which 5G unfolds. I think we're finally moving in the direction of lower frequency, like 6 gigahertz or so, which is a good thing, if only because it will make us competitive with the rest of the world, which tends to be going in that direction. Josh, I don't know whether you want to say anything about the recent FCC decision with regard to frequencies that are adjacent to GPS, but that might be another place where there's some concern about our dependence, especially in the Defense Department, on extremely accurate GPS measurements. And if the private sector deploys systems that might interfere with the precision of GPS, that could be a real problem.
I would prefer not to get too much into the technical details of some of those systems, but I would say that I think that there are many reasons why we need to decrease our dependence on GPS. It could be that we're adding to that list another reason, which is that in the economic competition over the future of 5G, which has significant national security implications, there are further reasons why we need to gradually wean ourselves off of that. But in the short term, I think there are a lot of other ways that the US can be competitive in the 5G competition that don't jeopardize our ability to operate. So I think generally the department's position has been to be focused on sharing spectrum as opposed to giving it over to those companies. And I think that those solutions are probably going to be the ones that make the most sense and enable us to move swiftly to compete with other countries that are operating at orders of magnitude faster in the 5G space than we are. And I think whoever sets the standards is going to drive adoption of a lot of other countries in terms of how they build their commercial infrastructure as well as military infrastructure. And I think, you know, that is a very important race to win because of all the privacy implications of who gets access to the world's data and what they choose to do with it. And I think that geopolitical implication of the 5G competition is the thing that concerns me the most.
So the broader implications of what Josh is saying are that standards and interoperability are really vital if you want to have a rich evolutionary capacity to use software to change functionality. And so the standards that are used for a lot of these systems, whether they're military or civilian, are pretty vital to our ability to make use of software as an evolutionary tool. And so I would agree with him that the standards are really important, and who manages the evolution of those standards is equally important.
I have a question from somebody at the Eisenhower School, and the question notes that many of us have noted difficulties in developing and buying to integrated requirements that reflect the reality of our environment. To drill down, there's no internet without energy and fragile supply chains, which are not just a DoD responsibility. How do you propose to the U.S. government to improve the supply chains and energy sector? And I think we can expand that out to the other areas of discussion that you just had as well, the standard setting, the communications, et cetera.
Yeah, I think generally supply chains we are seeing right this moment, because of the pandemic, the fragility of the supply chains associated with healthcare. And we're also seeing that those supply chains have been, for just general business, have been disrupted because we can't work the way we used to work in close proximity to each other. So I have had some really interesting interactions with some people at the Department of Commerce, specifically at NIST, who stepped back and said, holy cow, all these supply chains got disrupted specifically for protection, personal protection equipment, and the things that were needed for testing and everything else. And they said, why don't we step back and say, how could we reconstitute supply chains by having enough knowledge of people who can produce various and sundry pieces of equipment, or can perform other functions that the supply chain requires, including transport? Why don't we build a knowledge base that knows about all of that, so that when parts of it are disrupted, you have the information available to reconstitute the supply chains that need. And so that's one thing. The other one, of course, might be to consider doing more to build supply chains that are domestically operated, and so we aren't as deeply dependent on non-US resources in order to recover from situations like the one we're in right now.
So another question that's coming from a student in Kenya that's related to this is directed to Josh, and it's, what do you think is the risk of militarization of national supply chains, and can the model be used in developing states and still uphold liberal markets? And that's from one of our students in the CISA school from Kenya.
I'm trying to conceptualize what a militarization of the supply chain means. And it eludes me a little bit. I think what we see is that supply chains are now so much more complex in an era of globalization, that the dependencies affect all of the segments of our society. And I think this is Vint's point, is excellently made, that it affects our ability in this country to get toilet paper, it affects our ability to get PPE for our doctors and healthcare workers, but it also affects our military. And I think we have been increasingly concerned about supply chain dependencies for everything from microprocessors and chips to rare earth minerals to oil, and a whole bunch of things which have national security implications as well, both geopolitically and just in terms of our ability to field our own force. And I think that those things are going to deeply, deeply concern us for a long period of time. Until they are resolved and addressed, and that we figure out a way to build greater resilience into our supply chains. The interdependency of these supply chains can have a very stabilizing force, because, for example, the United States, China, Russia, or whatever, are often dependent on each other in ways that are counterintuitive or surprising. And it can also be a source of real conflict, as there's a competition for scarce resources, and the anxiety that nations experience around what they perceive as their vulnerability to an adversary can lead them to behave erratically. So I think it's an important question for political science as to whether or not this complex interdependence of supply chains is going to be a stabilizing influence or a cause of instigation. I think for better or worse, the developing world is completely enmeshed in this question. A lot of the resources that we're looking for, those supply chains involve countries all over the planet. Some are developed and some are not. We see growing geopolitical competition about access to those areas, whether it's bases and ports or it's mining in places like sub-Saharan Africa in the neighborhood of the student, but also all over the world. And I think that's going to extend to mining on the moon, and it will become interplanetary, and we will continue to project those competitions forward as that continues. So I think there's a lot of important open questions there for further study. But what I would say is for Eisenhower students or NDU students that are thinking about thesis topics, think of all the things that were written about oil and geopolitics and how it affected foreign policy, and take those ideas and apply them to questions of data, and apply them to fabrication of microelectronics, and ask yourself, is TSMC in Taiwan like the Straits of Hormuz or Saudi Arabia? Is the ability to manufacture microelectronics analogous to the ability to manufacture coal and iron in the 19th century or oil in the 20th century? And how do we understand the generation and flows of data as being a new natural resource, right? Populations are generating more and more and more data, and that data is very useful for a variety of political, military purposes. And who controls the data? Who has access to it? Where is it localized? How is it used? Who does it belong to? I mean, we're going to have very interesting geopolitical rivalries over data supply chains, which are the fuel for artificial intelligence, in the same way that in earlier eras we had geopolitical and military rivalries over other forms of supply chains.
So,
I said that because I want to hear what Vint thinks about some of those
Okay,
publications.
so actually these are well-made points. I agree with them generally. One thing I would point out about data is that it is a funny kind of consumable, because you can replicate it. It does, when you get it or when you copy it, you don't consume the other thing, you just make copies of it. So it doesn't have quite the same character as consumables do, which should give us some flexibility that we wouldn't otherwise have. But it's certainly correct to say that if you don't have access to the data, that's sort of like not having access to oil or some other important physical resource. So I am persuaded that we may have more choice in handling data deficit than we have in dealing with other real resource deficits. They may not be as rivalrous as the economists would say. I will agree, however, that data can be incredibly valuable, and protecting access to it may turn out to be very important. And so we should be asking ourselves, as Josh, I think, is suggesting, about our collections of data and to what degree we need to protect access to them in order to protect advantage, and under what circumstances we want to share that data for everybody's utility. When you think about global warming and the threat that that poses, sharing of information may turn out to be absolutely vital to a successful response to that particular threat.
So I'm going to merge two questions into one, and I think it will be our last question. I have so many more questions we can't ask, and so we'll see if we can do some sort of a follow-up in the future. But the question is essentially, how do we infuse tech-savvy talent into positions within DoD and the Pentagon across the board, whether that is in policy and leadership or technology talent at the worker level, all the way through? How do we make sure that we have access to this this new currency and form of information for great power competition and otherwise?
So Josh, you probably thought more about that than anybody, given the introduction of the whole notion of innovation in the defense context. So what's your immediate thought?
I have very strong and passionate beliefs about this. So thank you for the opportunity to take a first crack at it, Vint. This goes back to where our conversation began, about appreciating the qualities required of our leaders and our workforce to excel in an industrial era versus the qualities that we expect from our leaders and from our workforce to excel in a digital era. And I can't think of a single system in our military more anchored in the industrial era than talent management today. It has a totemic significance to our services because it fundamentally cuts to their sense of identity about who gets promoted and who gets to lead in the organization and who does not. And so one of the things about DOTMA, the Defense Officers Promotion Management Act, and our up and out system is that there's very, very few opportunities for lateral entry in the military. So as people move up through the ranks over decades, you find yourselves that in a situation where the only leaders that you have to choose from for your key positions are ones that have grown up in the culture and are responsive to its incentives. And so it will be very difficult and yet extremely important for the leaders that are appointed to key positions in the military to go way out of their way to educate themselves about the ways in which the things that made them successful in their career will not make them successful in the future. All the ways in which the instincts that made sense in the industrial era will trick them in the future. And so they have an incumbent upon themselves to think about different ways to lead their organizations and ways to make different decisions. They can be balanced out with civilian leaders, where there is greater opportunity to pull in people that have a technical understanding and a technical appreciation of these decisions. And so it is even more important than ever to bring in people with real technical expertise into key civilian positions and to figure out how to have greater mixing between the technology community and the military community. And I think anything that we can do to build upon the successes of organizations like the U.S. Digital Service, 18F, Technology Transformation Services at GSA, the Defense Digital Service, any of these communities that help people go back and forth, I think is going to help us get through this critical period. But there's no way that we will hire or recruit our way out of this problem. The only way to really maintain our position in the world is if we start valuing digital talent and organizing our work environment and our work processes and streams, our incentives around having career paths for digital natives, both civilian and in uniform. If we don't have people that are capable of having that sense of ownership over the complex systems that have been described, then we will be relegating responsibility for these systems at moments when it is most crucial for our government to understand how to move forward in this new era. And in the end of the day, it is not about the stuff, right? It's all about the people. And if you can't attract and retain the right people, it won't matter about any of the technology decisions we make. And so this is the most important and least well appreciated organizational challenge our leaders face today. If you gave every procurement authority, acquisition authority, an unlimited budget to the Department of Defense to buy whatever technology it wanted, if it didn't have the right people to make those decisions, it would continue to replicate the past instead of building the future.
So Josh, that's really a powerful observation, and I would distill out of that the observation that the incentives in the system are to promote people who won the last battle as opposed to the people who will win the next one. And that causes us to ask, how should we reformulate the mission of the Defense Department in order to change the incentive and to be able to prepare for future threats as opposed to rewarding success against past ones? And that's a hard problem. And I think you're right to, I'm glad you brought up the U.S. Digital Service, because that was a very clever construct that our former colleague Megan Smith introduced, if I remember right, as the Chief Technology Officer. So this idea of bringing civilian and military components together in some construct which is not the same as the ones we've used in the past might in fact be a very fresh area to explore. We clearly need that because we do need to be prepared for the next decade's threats, not the last decade.
Well, that's a great way to wrap up our discussion today. Where we began at the beginning is very much where we're ending up. We need to prepare for the whole breadth of everything that we're facing as a nation and apply whole of nation, whole of government, and whole of defense solutions to these problems. And I appreciate your comments on all of this. This has been one of the most interesting discussions I've had the privilege of participating in recently. I greatly appreciate your contributions on this. We will be sending out a survey to everybody who participated. I'd appreciate your response to that survey and any suggestions that you have for follow-up discussions or other speakers will be taken into account. Let us know what was really good about this and what we can improve, and we'll continue to do that. Josh and Vint, we may come back to you with some other questions or other opportunities in the future. This has generated an unbelievable number of questions during the chat, as well as the questions ahead of time, and we didn't get to anywhere near all of them. Thank you very much for your participation, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you at our next national security briefing.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye for now. Bye, Josh. Have a good weekend.